Today we have an expert guest on the communication side of the Apollo missions. His name is Jeff Crawford. He has a master's degree in electrical engineering. He is an amateur radio enthusiast and author of the book HF Filter Design. Please say hello to Jeff Crawford. How are you, Mr. Crawford?
I'm just fine.
Can you
Hello,
please
everyone.
Can you hold up your book for the audience, please? It's quite a work there.
Okay, this is it. It's
High power HF filter design. Excuse me. Yes.
it has far more reaching audiences than just amateur radio. It's suitable for anyone doing RF and microwave filter design. The book itself is like 468 pages long, so it's not a short read.
Right. Okay. Well, Jeff, today I wanted to ask you a few questions in regard to this sort of cottage industry that has developed about people that say the moon landings were a hoax. And since you're an expert on the communication side of things, I think that's one of the best ways to debunk those claims by looking at the logistics of what would go into faking the communications involved in those missions and if it's even plausible. So I'll let you take it from there, a quick overview of that principle.
Okay, there are multiple ways to look at this whole idea of were any of the Apollo missions faked. You can look at it from the standpoint of communications. You can look at it from the standpoint of if you were going to try and do this ulterior motive faking, how would you actually go about doing it, and is it even possible? One of the things I will share is that in the mid-1990s, I was working on something, and we would still print out information rather than have it necessarily online like we do today. In the mid-90s, I had a document. It was actually a book about this thick. It had roughly 10,000 different objects or debris that were up in space, and the way we describe that those objects is with what we call ephemeris data. With that information, you can, at any supposed instant in time, identify exactly where it is above the Earth. And so that was in the mid-90s, and the number of objects were a little over 10,000. Today, I don't know what the number is, but it's got to just be explosive as far as a number, well beyond 10,000. We have internet in the sky. We have some companies that want to put orbital planes up, and they're comprised of like 10,000 satellites. So, and that's just one company. So the amount of debris that is up in space, circulating around the Earth, is getting more and more, and it's going to be a problem. In fact, it's already a problem.
Right.
The reason I introduced this is that at some point in time, we're going to have to go up and basically collect as much of this debris as we can. Otherwise, it's not going to be safe to launch, whether it's another satellite or a manned mission. And the reason this has not been done yet is because not just the general cost, but the cost in fuel and the ability to maneuver in order to get close enough to this debris to pick it up is just almost beyond description. And then you multiply that times the fact that I just said there are thousands and thousands of pieces of this debris up there. It's a huge problem. And so going back to the moon mission, in order to do some of the things that you'd have to do to fake it, you would be having to do some of the kinds of things, orbit maintenance, orbit matching, those kinds of things that heretofore we have never done as a society on Earth because it's just too hard. Um, and so
And
back
that's
to,
talking about, again, like to the hoax point,
that's right,
going into orbit and trying to mimic signals by where you are in the orbit, or
right. So let's touch on that a little bit more.
well, quickly, could you just give a very basic overview of sort of how radio communications work, particularly as they apply to outer space and
Okay.
the moon?
So some of these things are generic in that they apply to any communications, whether it's my amateur radio hobby, cell telephones, or communications with Apollo and eventually the surface of the moon. Communications fundamentally come down to what is this term we call signal to noise ratio. If the signal is not a certain degree stronger than the background noise, and noise is with us always, it's just whether or not there's more or less of it. And unless that signal to noise ratio is high enough, it doesn't matter how much power you're transmitting. If the noise is somewhat comparable to the signal strength, you're not going to hear any audio, you're not going to get video, or it's going to be so noisy that you won't be able to make out images. So the name of the game in the communications business is signal to noise ratio.
Even in outer space, because
Yes.
well,
It all,
I thought it was a vacuum, so there's still white noise, for lack of a better.
there's still noise. Anytime a directional antenna, and that's what we use when we're trying to listen for Apollo back in the 60s, anytime that antenna gets close to a star, for example, if you aim one of these dishes at the sun, the amount of noise coming off that sun is just unbelievable. It masks anything. And so this is another reason that we use directional antennas, so that if, for example, when we pointed at the moon to get Apollo, if the sun were to our far left, this directional antenna has what we call main beam to side lobe rejection. And it's a good thing it does, because that property attenuates a lot of the noise that we would otherwise be getting from the sun. And that's absolute paramount importance, otherwise you won't have the signal to noise ratio so that you can make out any intelligence of the signal.
Well, so I guess what you're saying is, to the layperson, like when you're particularly in outer space, when you're trying to pick up a signal, obviously the antennas you're using have to be pointed in a very specific direction to pick up what it is that you're looking for.
That's right. So with respect to the kind of antennas that the ground stations in the Apollo era used, they used large parabolic dish antennas. And one of those, it depends on the frequency. If let's say you had a dish that was 60 feet in diameter, I'm just going to throw out some numbers. They're probably off, but I want to just illustrate this. A 60-foot diameter dish, let's say at 4 gigahertz, 4,000 megahertz, let's say it's got 60 dB of gain. 60 dB is a power ratio of 1,000,000. So if you were just using a standard little vertical antenna that has a gain of 1, compared to that parabolic dish at 4 gigahertz, that parabolic dish, if it were aimed at the transmitter you wanted to listen to, it would have a power gain compared to just a vertical antenna of 1,000,000, 60 dB. If you went to a higher frequency, and this is some of why we do that, let's say you went to 8 or 10 gigahertz, that same 60-foot dish, instead of a 60 dB gain, it might have 72 or 75 dB of gain. So these principles apply whether it's space, terrestrial, whatever.
So is the reason, for instance, with Apollo, why we know they had, I think the primary location stations were in Australia and Spain, the ones outside of the U.S. Is that because as the Earth was rotating on its axis, it always had to be, one side of the Earth would be away from the moon, and then you would transition over to the other listening station when it was facing the moon to pick up the
Right, and
communications?
they had more than two stations, but the principle is the same. Uh, as one Earth station started to lose the view of the moon, they would transition over to another station that had better view of the moon. And you find that for example, let's say we're trying to get a signal from the moon, as the geometry gets such that when we try to see the moon, it's down near our horizon. That means the radio signal is having to go through increasing amounts of atmosphere. And when that happens, we get more and more loss. So you have to have more than just two ground stations because of these kind of effects that happen at the limb of the Earth. Uh, it's also not perfect in that we know that the Earth not only rotates, but it has an eccentricity to its orbit in that it is not in the same plane as the plane of the sun. The reason we have seasons is because the Earth is on a canted orbit, and so during some parts of a year, we will be above the equatorial plane of the sun, and at other times of the year, 6 months later, we'll be below that equatorial plane, and that's what gives us the seasons. But I want to go back to this idea of signal to noise ratio. So when you consider the antennas that they had on the Apollo when they're on the moon, they wanted simple antennas. They were not nearly as advanced as things are today, and so they wanted to have simple antennas on the moon, and the hardest work would be provided by the stations on the Earth. And what do I mean by the hardest work? The transmitters on the Earth would be larger as far as number of watts of power. The antennas on the Earth would be larger in terms of diameter, like I said, 60 or maybe even 90 feet. I don't recall exactly what the dish sizes were, but they were considerable. And the larger those dishes become, the greater the power gain. And whenever you size like a mission to the moon, or you're doing work with just like internet in the sky, you perform what's called a link budget so that you know whether or not with a given size antenna, both at the transmitter and the receiver, and the amount of power that the transmitter is using, will you have sufficient signal to noise ratio such that you can communicate in the way that's desired. So because of the limited size, battery power, all those kinds of things, available to the Apollo mission on the moon, I think they may have only been transmitting 10 watts. 10 watts. Your cell phone, when you're at the extreme of a cell coverage region, is going to transmit around 3 watts. So we were going to the moon with 10 watts, but the reason that was feasible was because of these huge dishes and the way they would concentrate the power toward the moon.
Jeff, about those huge dishes. So how did they determine where on the Earth these dishes needed to be? And I guess that sort of segues into this idea that, in short, basically, in order to communicate with them into outer space, to the lay person, it's not as simple as just having a powerful antenna. There's very specific calculations that are involved of knowing where to direct that antenna to pick up the signal. And that is very hard, if not impossible, to fake. and we'll get into that. I want to ask you more about that in a second. But can you speak on these big stations and how they would go about determining where they needed to be on the Earth?
Okay, yes. I don't want to get into the microwave complexities of this, but up near what we call the feed of one of these parabolic dishes, there are instruments up there which, if we steer, let's say we steered a little too far to the left or right, we would see a diminished amount of received power coming from Apollo on the surface of the moon. Same way, if we went too far high or too far low, we would see a change in power also. So you have servo mechanisms back in those days that would monitor those power levels and keep those great big dishes pointed such that they were receiving a maximum power at any instant. So if you can imagine, let's say one of the dishes is in Australia, and another one of the dishes is at like Ascension Island. I know that was one of them, and there are probably at least 4 or 5 others. What we would call the pointing solution, in other words, what elevation, what azimuth each one of those dishes is pointing to get a signal from the moon, they're all going to be different, and they're going to be changing with time every second. And so just because you have the pointing information for, let's say, Diego Garcia, that was another listening station.
In the Indian Ocean, I think?
In the Indian Ocean. That will be totally different than like Hawaii or Australia. And
well, and another key element is all of these stations have to communicate with each other and coordinate each other so that there's continued coverage of the...
That's true. But back to what I was saying with regards to our need to be a garbage collector of all the debris up in space. And the reason we haven't done it is because the resources and technology required to do those kind of maneuvers and match orbits and at the same time not get hit yourself by a piece of debris, it's we just can't do it yet. It's just extraordinarily complex to even consider such a thing. In order to fake a reception from these multiple ground stations, you would have to do all of this fancy orbital maneuvering, which would take just unheard of amounts of rocket fuel and energy. And oh, by the way, you're going to do this over the duration of the entire mission. There's no calculator that has enough significant digits to even consider such a thing, because you're going to have to make this signal come from the appropriate place in the sky, in line with where the moon is, no matter where you are on the surface of the Earth. And that is about impossible to do.
Well, also not just in line with where the moon is, but with their purported trajectory of the craft as it's going to and from the moon,
Well,
correct?
yes,
Yeah.
that's
Which
true.
gets into Doppler shift, right? Which is how they tracked the trajectory.
No, Doppler shift is going to affect any radio signal. And again, I don't want to get into the mathematics of that, but you can you could understand what the amount of Doppler shift or frequency shift is in a radio signal, and you can back into, okay, how fast is that object going? And it also comes down to trigonometry from the standpoint that, let's say you've got a policeman with a radar gun. For him to get an accurate reading of your velocity, he needs to be pointing that gun straight at you as you're driving straight at him. If he's off to the side and not in direct alignment with what we would call your velocity vector, he's going to get an erroneous reading. Now, he could back into what that actual speed is that you're going if he knows that angle between what your velocity vector is as you're driving your car and what his angular position is. But again, all this stuff, it gets really, really complex.
And the average
Now,
traffic cop doesn't know that. So everyone, remember that when you go to traffic court the next time.
the policeman's radar was not coincident with my velocity vector, although you got to be careful here because when that condition prevails, the policeman's radar gun is going to show a slower velocity. So if he's off to the side and you're already breaking the speed limit and then you call on that argument, the argument is right, but the judge, if he knows physics, is going to say, well, then you are just vastly breaking the speed limit. So you need to be careful about that.
Hopefully he got a liberal arts degree, the judge.
Right. So one of the other things that back in the 60s would have been a monumental thing to fake is the time delay. In this digital era that we're in today, it's far, far easier, but you've got to go back 60 years. We didn't have all this digital signal processing, the rapid memory access, read and write, such that we could just very, very simply delay a signal. Back in those days, the way you delayed a signal is you would put a radio signal through a length of cable. And I meant to do some calculations before doing this, and I didn't. But there is a velocity factor associated with any coaxial cable. And it usually ranges between like 66% and around 88%, the speed of light. So what that means is that the radio signal is going to go slower in a cable than if we're going through free space. And so that is how you could introduce delay. But the problem is when we're talking about 1.25 or whatever the number is, one-way delay, the amount of cable that you would require is miles, probably in length. I haven't run the numbers, but the amount of cable to experience that type of delay would be extraordinary. And what happens, let me finish this thought. What happens when you run a signal through that much cable, there is so much loss in the cable that by the time you got to the end of the cable, it's just going to be noise. It's just going to be noise. There'll be delay, but any engineer or scientist would be able to tell that that signal was doctored with. Because once you lose what we call that signal to noise ratio, you can't get it back. Once you've introduced...
Yeah, all the words would be gargled, or the quality would just be horrible.
The quality would go down, and for a mechanism like this where you're using, probably upwards of miles of cable to get that much delay, certainly thousands of feet anyway, there would be so much loss in that cable that the signal to noise ratio would be degraded so much that it could possibly be not useful. Now, yes, you can put amplifiers along that span of cable, and each one of those amplifiers has a certain amount of latency or delay, which would require you to use less cable. But the bottom line is still, this gets extremely complex and very, very burdensome. And that's just the delay for one station.
Right.
The distance is going to vary from Diego Garcia to the moon or Hawaii to the moon. And there could be enough difference there that an astute engineer or scientist would be able to see that there was this unexplained difference.
So on the delay, in a far less kind of technical way to look at things, so they had Capcom, which was basically at Mission Control. Supposedly only the astronauts were the ones that were actually speaking to the Apollo astronauts that were actually out in space. So the idea of the two groups of astronauts simply faking this delay, everyone in Mission Control obviously would have been wise to that, correct? Because they would hear, even though they weren't directly speaking to the astronauts, they would see when the signals were coming in and if that delay was authentic or not. Is that
Oh, that's just the beginning of the
problems?
authenticity. Uh, when we were going to the moon, I was in high school. And my brother and I wrote NASA, and we got the frequencies of the different links. And there were so many people all around the world
Right.
listening
Yeah.
for these transmissions. It wasn't that you just had to like fake out Mission Control or fake out Diego Garcia. You had to fake out probably tens of thousands of receivers with lots of smart people
Right.
at those receivers. Uh, I've used this phrase before, and it's absolutely true. The amount of technology and complexity that you would have to overcome to fake this idea that the Apollo missions were not real, the complexity and technology required would be more vast than what it took to go to the moon in the first place. So why didn't you just go to the moon and forget faking all of this? Because some of this couldn't even be done today. In fact, the lion's share of it still couldn't be done. One of the most difficult things of all is this idea that you've got a pointing solution that's going to be different for every receiver as a function of where it's located on the Earth. There's no simple answer to that. You could not launch a rocket with enough fuel to maintain the orbit that it needed to be in to do this faking, and that's only for possibly one vector from Earth,
What
not
about
tens of thousands.
a satellite as opposed to, like a manned craft
Again,
or rocket?
it's the same issue. You could not put up enough satellites to pull off this hoax. You just couldn't.
Right.
And I'm not a astrodynamicist, but I've had people with those degrees work for me. And whenever we talk about changing orbits, we talk about delta V and the amount of change in velocity that we would have to incur in order to change the orbit. It's just not even at this point in time, 60 years later, this is not possible. This is not like Star Trek, where we just hover any place we want, so many whatever number of miles we want above a planet's surface. It just is not. It does not work that way. If you look at the whole idea of a geosynchronous orbit, is that the centripetal force that a satellite incurs is due to what its velocity is. And that centripetal force is equal and opposite to the attraction due to the Earth's gravity.
Right.
And so if you're at a different altitude above the Earth, you've got a whole different scenario that you got to do with. It's not just a matter of maintaining your orbital speed. You've got a lot of things going on that I think, from my perspective, are impossible to counteract by today's terms.
Yeah, you've made some very good points, and these are points that I feel like are completely neglected on all of these podcasts or documentaries that are made about the moon landing. This idea of it being a hoax, because even if you were to say the staff at all these listening stations that were part of the official Apollo program were in on some elaborate hoax involving thousands of people, that still doesn't explain all these amateur people that you referenced, who also, many of whom were also able to hear these communications, who were not part of the government or any sort of formal body. It doesn't explain the Soviet Union, who obviously was all over this, monitoring it. Why wouldn't they come out and say, no, you didn't achieve this? It just kind of sinks the whole thing, that aspect of things.
I mean, one of the things that any kind of attorney looks for is how many witnesses or how many subject matter experts will be able to make authoritative claims in support of their client. My gosh, you've got thousands and thousands of people from all different nationalities, different countries, different locations that witness this great event of these signals coming back from the moon. You can't fake that.
Right.
You just can't.
Yeah. Two things I wanted to touch on really quickly. Going back to Doppler shift. Now, are you saying that they would use that to track the trajectory of the craft by how it manifests in the communications, or how does that work?
No, the biggest thing that they would be concerned about where Doppler shift comes in is that Doppler shift is going to cause the frequencies that you listen to be shifted as a function of what the velocity of that transmitter is going. And one of the things that they have to do is they have what we would call a very narrow communications link. And the reason that the official term would be more like carrier tracking. There would be just a single tone, and they would have the antenna pointed at that, and they would be doing, left, right, up, and down to maximize power being received of that tone, which is a very single frequency, and they would be doing this every second. Well, in order to have the optimum or the maximum signal to noise ratio in what this is called as a tracking loop, they have a very narrow bandwidth, very narrow. I mean, it could be 100 or 200 hertz, which is very small when you're already at hundreds, if not thousands of megahertz. And so if you don't compensate for that frequency by offsetting it by what you believe to be the accompanying Doppler shift, you won't hear the carrier because you'll be listening to the wrong frequency.
Yeah, I wanted to ask that. So let's say before they left, I guess they had a plan, very specific plan trajectory of how the path they were going to take to the moon.
Right.
And so you could say, well, they knew beforehand where and when they would need, based on their speed and stuff, where they were going to need to position the antennas. Well, what if they got knocked off path a little bit? Like, in Apollo 13, they have some event out there and they get thrown off that trajectory. Would the astronauts out in space, I guess through their instruments, they would be able to relay back to mission control how many degrees off they are, and then they would be able to recalibrate everything back on Earth?
No. Any kind of recalibration would be done on the Earth because we don't want to force the astronauts or the people in the spacecraft or on the moon to have to do any more work than necessary. And even if you did have some kind of aberrant behavior, whether it's in the velocity vector or the orbit was slightly different, percentage-wise, more than likely it was still in what we call the capture range of the phase-locked loop.
Okay.
And so...
so there's a little bit of a margin of error.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. What typically happens is let's say mission control lost a signal. They will widen the bandwidth and they will start sniffing around for energy. And when they think that they've got energy at a certain frequency, they will shrink that bandwidth down to enhance the signal to noise ratio. And that will happen if indeed that was signal energy. And as the signal energy gets higher and higher, that bandwidth has gotten less and less so that the signal to noise ratio gets higher and higher. And that gives them a more accurate solution when they have a high signal to noise ratio. But it's not uncommon even today that you might lose a link or lose carrier lock, or there are all sorts of terms. Carrier lock, frequency lock, phase lock, all these kinds of things. These are things that when you're in the space business you have to be prepared for, and have solutions for. And they had all those kind of solutions, while not as elegant back in the 60s as compared to today. But if they didn't have those kind of solutions at the ready, they would have lost communications all the time. You have to be able to reacquire communications.
I have a quick question in regard to that. I believe in Apollo 13, when they had a slingshot around the dark side of the moon, I think they lost communications when they were on the dark side of the moon. I don't remember
Absolutely.
if that was okay, so that would for sure happen. The moon would.
Absolutely, because everything that, whether it's satellites or the Apollo mission, we talk about line of sight communications. At these frequencies, gigahertz and many gigahertz, they just go in straight lines. When you're on the Earth and you're at much lower frequencies, typically no more than maybe 50, 60 megahertz, you can get different kinds of effects where signals can go around the Earth. It can be ionospheric bounce, what a lot of people would call skip. I use skip when I'm on amateur radio, and in fact, this last weekend I talked to probably 180 different countries, and skip was a major part of it. But as you get higher, above 30 to 50 megahertz, those properties do not come into play. Now, at 50 and maybe even 100 some megahertz, you can get other effects related to weather, like tropospheric ducting and those kinds of things. But those are somewhat anomalous, and they're not reliable from the standpoint of having a communications network that relies on that stuff, because they're going to be dependent on what the weather patterns are. Is there a thunderstorm nearby? What's the humidity? And so that would not be a reliable communications method.
So as you go up in hertz, they actually become more straight lined, let's say.
They're always straight line. The difference is that when the signals are, a lot of people will say 30 megahertz or below, that signal will go up somewhere between 50 to 70 miles, and it hits different layers of the ionosphere. There are D layers, E layers, F layers. They all have different kinds of characteristics as far as what they do to radio waves. And obviously, well, maybe it's not obviously, but if that signal bounces off the ionosphere at 50 miles, when it comes back to Earth, let's say maybe it comes back to Earth 3,000 or 4,000 miles farther away. If that signal, however, bounced off an upper layer of the ionosphere that was like 70 miles high, it's a trigonometry problem. That radio signal will maybe not come back down to Earth until 7,000 or 8,000 miles.
Right.
And from the standpoint of worldwide communications at below 30 megahertz, you want to have your signal interact with the Earth, i.e. hit the Earth, a minimum number of times, because every time the signal bounces off the Earth and goes back up to hit the ionosphere, it loses power. So a signal that skips more times is going to be weaker.
So, Jeff, in your expertise, what is sort of like an estimate of the minimum hertz that you would need to receive signals from, let's say, just outside of Earth's orbit in low outer space, let's say, and get through the ionosphere?
Several of the astronauts that have been on the International Space Station have used one of the amateur frequency bands called 2 meters, which is 144 to 148 megahertz. And in fact, a few years ago, I orchestrated a situation where we had, 4,000 grade school kids that were all listening to an interaction directly with the International Space Station, and this was all being done over that frequency of around 146 megahertz.
That's pretty cool. And just for reference, FM radio starts at 88 and goes to 108
Right.
megahertz. Okay.
Right. FM radio can really be at any frequency. The reason that it's relegated to those higher frequencies is that the intelligence in an FM signal is imparted to wavering of that frequency. And so if you're down at a lower frequency and you still need to wave around, let's say 30 or 40 kilohertz, that's a bigger fraction of the frequency span than if you were at like 100 or 144 megahertz. So we're comparing a ratio of like, let's say 10 kilohertz divided by 30 megahertz, 30 times or 30 e to the sixth, or 10 kilohertz divided by 144 e to the sixth. And it gets much it's much more efficient from the standpoint of what we call spectral efficiency if we use FM at higher frequencies rather than at lower frequencies. And that's why the FCC and other governments have instituted those kind of rules and regulations.
Okay, so to communicate or at least pick up signals from deep, well, it's not, I guess, deep space, but from the moon, 240,000 miles away or so, you would need to be operating at very high frequency levels, like 1 gigahertz or...
Well, that's best. What you find is different frequency ranges will have different characteristics. And one of the ones that is, well, there are two different areas that are problematic from the standpoint of space communications. And it has to do with what the resonance frequency is of the water molecule. So it turns out that, I should have this number memorized, but in the 20s of gigahertz, it's almost like there is a large attenuator in that you would have to transmit, instead of like 10 watts, you'd maybe have to transmit 1 million or 10 million watts in order to get through the upper atmosphere of Earth because of this resonance phenomena of the water molecule. There's another range up in the area of 30-ish gigahertz, and it's not as debilitating to interstellar communications or space communications as that lower frequency in the 20s of gigahertz. I'm not revealing any big secrets here, but one of the things that's nice about this resonance phenomena due to the water molecule is if you had one satellite that's talking to another and you don't want to be eavesdropped on, you're going to use what we call that crosslink frequency. You're going to have that frequency be near the resonant frequency of the water molecule so that none of those signals can be heard back on Earth. So we use these kind of phenomena to our advantage, and sometimes we suffer the disadvantages also, but we can also play upon those and take advantage of that for more secure communications.
Okay. So I did want to quickly ask about the Van Allen belts, because that's one aspect of this that these conspiracy theorists like to point out, that just physically the astronauts couldn't have gone through the belts. There's too much radiation. That's another topic. But in terms of communications, do they have any effect on the radio signals that we're talking about? And if so, what would they be?
Well, this is outside my area of expertise. I will say this, irrespective of does it impact the actual communications signal, the fact is that you're going to incur possible serious damage to your electronics, especially back in the 60s, if you were anywhere close to those Van Allen radiation belts. They will wreak havoc with electronics. You'll have premature failures, you'll get what we call SEUs, single event upsets, just all sorts of things can start to happen. And back in those days, yes, we knew that there was radiation out there, but our knowledge today so vastly exceeds what was known back then. When we put satellites aloft, they're designed for all the radiation hazards. We didn't even know what a lot of those hazards were. Yes, uh, the
Right.
Van Allen from the University of Iowa discovered them, but there are other areas of radiation as well. One which I don't know if many people are familiar with, but there's this area called the South Atlantic anomaly,
Right.
and that creates headaches for satellites as well. In fact, that's some of my job security is has been dealing with the effects of the South Atlantic anomaly. So again, space is a very complex business, a very costly business, and in most cases, you don't get second chances.
Well, how were they able to pass through the Van Allen belts then without even just, physical radiation to their person, without electronic failure? And is that what happened in Apollo 13 when they had the electronic failure? Were they in the belts when that happened?
No, no. But to your first question, that's outside my area of expertise. Uh, I
I, I
would I would say this that you don't want to launch and go through the Van Allen belts.
well,
Whether
they
that's done
def
today in practice, I don't know, but you wouldn't want to.
well, they definitely picked a trajectory where it was minimal exposure and time spent in the belts. But I think you have to go through them to some extent to get to the moon, I believe, right? It's
Uh, I don't I don't know. I'm not an orbital dynamicist. I will tell you this. Uh, One of the systems I worked on years ago, we didn't know what was going on when it first happened. But every time the satellite went over that part of the Atlantic, power converters were shutting off, and we were losing functionality on the satellite. And it was between that and other experiences like that that the knowledge of the South Atlantic anomaly became, in the trade space as far as, oh, you got to worry about that. We didn't know about that until these things they were experienced.
well, this is kind of a detour of this conversation, but do you think that has anything to do with the Bermuda Triangle? That's not really the South Atlantic, but do you think there could be any correlation
Nah,
there?
I don't know. I'm
Okay.
not. I'm not.
That
I don't
anomaly,
know.
it basically means that that's the point at which the belt dips the lowest towards the Earth's atmosphere. Is that the basic
I
explanation?
I don't know, Adam. I don't know.
Okay.
Um, I just know it's degrading effects on the electronics, and sometimes it's immediate, and sometimes it's stressful to the what we call the gate structures in these advanced transistors, and it just leads to a premature failure. Weeks, months, maybe even years later. But the electronics don't last as long as they would have had they not been subjected to it.
Okay.
This is something that, but before you fly any electronics these days, you understand what it's called their rad hardness, and there's a graduated scale on this, and so how rad hard your devices are. You have an understanding of the orbit or trajectory you're going to go through when you launch or go into orbit. And all of that stuff has to be figured out as part of the overall electronic design. Things have got, in order to make some of these satellites last as long as they do, you have to understand and take into account all of these kinds of things. Otherwise, they don't last that long because uh, the radiation, for example, will lead to premature failures if the devices are not rad hard.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good overview, but one last question. I think this is a good segue to wrap things up. What you were just talking about is the one of the biggest things that people like to point to why they say the moon landing was a hoax is they say, how did we do this, 5 decades ago when we say we can't get back there now? And this was even before, when computers were still in their infancy. How is this possible? It's almost like our technology has regressed. So I'd just like your quick opinion on that.
Okay, this is my opinion. I can't say that I can, ascribe well-known facts or resources like that, but this is my opinion.
Based on decades in the field of, yes.
So when the Challenger blew up many years ago, the United States had focused all its attention on the way to orbit was with the shuttle. Well, suddenly now we don't have the shuttle because something happened and we've got to figure out what it is. But yet the United States cannot stand down for 3 or 4 years and not put any satellites up into orbit for that period of time. So what we had to do is we had to go back to expendable launch vehicles. I know for a fact because I was the company I was with for 32 years. We were sending people up to Vandenberg Air Force Base every week, and this went on for months. And we were trying to resuscitate the knowledge and know-how required to launch these expendable rockets. And I don't know how many, but there were a good number of them that blew up over the Pacific because we had lost the recipe. We had lost the recipe. And the same is true today of the kind of engines and power plants that are required to lift that much mass up into orbit. Now, SpaceX has gone a long ways, but until SpaceX came along, the producer of the most powerful rocket engines was Russia. We lost all that capability when the Saturn V was retired and other large vehicles like the Titan IV. We lost those capabilities, and it's not easily resurrected. You can lose recipes for how things are done. I mean, just look at the Rosetta Stone. If we didn't have the Rosetta Stone, we wouldn't be able to uncover all these different languages and what they meant. And yet, back in the day, you had hundreds of thousands of people speaking these languages, but without that Rosetta Stone, we wouldn't be able to figure it out today. Just because we did it one day doesn't mean that years or decades later you can just instantly do it again. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that we are so risk averse that really slows down advances today. Our tolerance as a country for risk is so low compared to the days of Apollo. The kinds of things the NASA scientists and others were doing to get us to the moon on the schedule that President Kennedy laid out, there were thousands of people doing heroic things, working unbelievable numbers of hours. A friend of mine, a Navy commander, was asked as part of his master's program to do a review of the power system on the Apollo. And he wanted my help because he wasn't an EE, and so I looked at it with him and spent some time with him. The documentation that is even available today was just remarkable to me. This is when we were still using punch cards for computers. We don't have Microsoft Word and all this stuff.
Slide rulers.
Yes, the documentation is just extraordinary. The amount of manpower and skill and expertise that went in to get us to the moon, our society today isn't willing to do that.
Right.
They're just not.
Yeah.
They're more interested in vacation.
I heard just the other day in doing some background research for this podcast that apparently Apollo 14, when it took off, the night it took off, they didn't want to postpone it because Nixon was in town to watch the launch, and there were thunderstorms, and they took off anyway, and they got struck by lightning 2 times on their way into space in the atmosphere. Now that might have been kind of stupid on their part, but I think that kind of sums up the difference between then and now. They would never.
Well, politics
Probably.
is always there. I remember one time I was flying into LAX, and we kept going around and around and around. And later that day, I found out that it was because Bill Clinton wanted to have his hair cut on Air Force One on the tarmac at LAX, and they closed down all incoming traffic. So politics is politics.
Well, that's a good story. All right. Well, I think that was a good overview of just in short how elaborate and in so many words impossible a hoax of the moon landings, particularly on the communication side of things, would have been. And Jeff, I thank you for taking your time and going over things with us today.
Well, thank you, and I hope it was mostly understandable. I probably got off on a few tangents here and there, but there are so many things that you would have to contrive or deceive people about that I think it's in the realm of just impossible.
Right. Okay, well, I think that does it. If for anyone listening, if this has piqued your interest in amateur radio or any of the discussed topics, please feel free to check out Jeff's book. It's available on Amazon. It's called High Power HF Filter Design, and that is Jeff K Zulu KOZR.
No, there are no O's. K0 Zulu
Okay,
Radio.
okay, there we have it. That's it for today, folks, and thank you for watching. Jeff, thank you for stopping by.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Bye.